The intersection between animal and human health happens on a daily basis. If not the pets in our homes, they're the food on our dinner tables. Join me, Dr. Mercy Korir, on this week's episode of Health Digest as we take a look at areas of animal health such as factory farming, the use of antibiotics, and other areas of animal welfare that have a direct impact on your health.
There's a whole connection. Whatever you do at the farm ends up on the crop, which ultimately ends up on the fish. And so that is the reason why we are starting to say we need to look at production systems that are sustainable. Because the way we are doing it currently is not sustainable. And I think that is something that the organization is looking at critically.
For food security, which is availability and access to food by all individuals, sustainable farming that puts into consideration production without harming natural resources and being socially responsible is important.
A humane and sustainable food system is a food system that ensures that it is sustainable. That is to say, it is not causing problems to humanity, and it is able to self-propagate and last beyond the short period of time, beyond the short term. So essentially, we're looking at the whole value chain. Essentially, the food system is the whole value chain from production all the way to the food getting onto your table. And in that process, especially in livestock, the animals that you use must be kept in a way that they are not undergoing unnecessary pain, they are not going through situations of cruelty or suffering, which then drives that process of ensuring that it is humane. The way you slaughter it, the kind of housing they're in, the processes that they go through, there are certain husbandry or management practices that we need to look at critically. Things like debeaking for chickens or tail docking in pigs are critical things. And when you need to do some of these painful processes, then you also need to look at how minimizing that pain as a process. So essentially, it's about ensuring that whatever animals we're using are used in a humane way, and then ensuring that the whole production system or the whole food system for that matter is sustainable. It means that it's able to cater for itself and sustain itself without necessarily intervention by government giving things like subsidies.
The United Nations Environment Assembly, UNEA, recognized that there's a connection between animal welfare, public health, and environmental health. Farming and other forms of food productions have a direct link to public health, and as seen in the recent past, animals have been the source of epidemics and the current COVID-19 pandemic.
Factory farming is essentially huge farms where a lot of animals are kept in very small enclosed spaces. And predominantly we see factory farming around poultry and pigs, because we then put a lot of animals in that space. By so doing, we create a situation where the animals are looked at like commodities. We do not care about the humane aspect of it. We don't necessarily provide for all the animals' needs based around the 5 fundamental freedoms for animal welfare, ensuring that the animals get enough food and water, ensuring that the animals have enough space. And I think for factory farming, the critical thing is that stocking density. If it's beyond a certain level, say for chickens, if it's beyond 30 kilograms per meter squared, then you're beginning to move into factory farms. Then around that space, you also need to provide for what we call enrichment. Enrichment is essentially items that the animals uses to express its naturalness. If it's chicken, the chicken normally scratch, so you need to have a house that has enough litter for it, dry, friable litter for it to scratch. If it's pigs, they root, so you need to have enough bedding for them to be able to root. Chickens also patch, so you need to have facilities for them to be able to patch. The pigs are also very intelligent animals and play with toys. So you need, beyond just space, you need the capacity for the animal to express its naturalness around that process. We're also looking at freedom from pain, injury, and disease. And for me, that's one of the critical ones that then connect us to public health, because a lot of diseases that have been seen to occur in production system are also zoonotic, which means they can be transmitted to human populations. But the other big thing about factory farms is the fact that because you are putting too many animals in an enclosed space, you tend to have microorganisms then mutating because they are mixing. You have human, for instance, human influenza virus mixing with swine influenza or avian influenza, leading to antigenic shifts, which then lead to pandemics. In fact, when the COVID pandemic started, one of the things that ILRI and UNEP did was to look at pandemics that was occurred between 1940 and now. And there's a very good report that shows that 50% of all the zoonotic diseases that have occurred between 1940 and now actually coming from factory farming systems.
There's always a possibility of antigenic shifts leading to disease outbreaks such as the avian influenza, swine flu, and COVID-19, which is said to have started in a wet market.
But of big and critical importance for us is the antimicrobial resistance issue. Globally, antimicrobial resistance is actually being touted as the next pandemic, because we are having a situation where animals, because of how we keep them, to suppress diseases coming from them, we have become intelligent and use antibiotics for prophylaxis or metalaxis. That then leads to a situation where you're introducing antibiotics into the food chain, because whatever you introduce into whatever the animal consumes or injected or is given to them ultimately ends on your table. But at antibiotic level, we then look at two things that are important. One is the fact that you end up with antibiotic residues in the food, either it's milk, eggs, or meat, that is also detrimental to human populations when they consume. But secondary to that, you're also ending up with situations where you are ending up in a situation where you're creating resistant organisms, because the use of antibiotics in that production system, for various reasons, leads to selection. The bacteria or the organisms that are sensitive to the antibiotic, of course, will be wiped off. And progressively, you're leading to a situation where you're ending up with antibiotic-resistant genes being propagated from food to human populations.
The World Bank estimates that 700,000 people die of antimicrobial resistance every year, those living in low and middle-income countries like Kenya being the most vulnerable. This death toll could rise to as many as 10 million people by the year 2050.
A year or two back, we did a survey where we collected meat, poultry and pig meat from supermarkets, where the end user is actually going to buy it from, and took it to Kemri. And essentially what we found out from that simple piece of study was that 33% of the meat was actually contaminated with what we call superbugs. And superbugs are organisms that are resistant to 3 or more antibiotics. And that then starts giving you the indication around the challenge that we're looking at. But to just complete the picture then, because people then say, do we then avoid eating meat or animal products for that matter? The situation is even more interesting, because currently we are doing a study with Kenya Agriculture Livestock Research Organization, KALRO, where we are looking at the impact of big pig farms on the environment. And so one of the things we've done is to go and collect samples, manure, whatever is inside the pig house, and then see what organisms you isolate or what antibiotic residues you isolate if the farmers used antibiotics. Then quickly collect samples from outside the poultry house in the environment, because in this country the tendency has been, after have finished production, the manure that is in the poultry house or in the pig house then is taken to the farm to grow crops. And so we've also sampled crops and the environment around the poultry or pig houses. And essentially what we are seeing early days is that whatever was used in the pig house or the poultry house ultimately is being found in the environment.
They're also collecting water upstream and downstream from the farms to determine impact of the run of water on aquatic and marine life, and as part of monitoring antimicrobial use elaborated by country-specific AMR action plans.
There are certain things that it looks at. One is sensitization. I think that's part of what we are doing, sensitizing the poultry farmers or the farmers who actually use antibiotics, that you can actually grow poultry or pigs without use of antibiotics by just adhering to good biosecurity measures at the farm level, ensuring that the disease cannot get into the farm by ensuring you have appropriate fencing, the workers who take showers, change their clothes, ensuring that they have good level of hygiene and sanitation with both at the farm level, and even the workers observe the same, ensuring that the animals are treated, are vaccinated. Disease control mechanisms. One of it is good vaccinations, then negates the need for treatment when the animal gets sick. So those are some of the things we are looking at. But we're also looking at educating the consumer. And for us, the consumer becomes a big person in this chain. Because if the consumer understands the implication of buying products that have not been raised in high welfare production system, they can use their purchasing power to drive industry to do the right thing. We're also working with industry, and if you've looked at recently, you've seen one of our big producers actually making a commitment that they will not use antibiotics. We are asking corporates that are in production system or even in the value chain, supermarkets and retailers, to start saying that you want to ensure that whoever is providing us with, supplying us with the animal products, that they are not using antibiotics unnecessarily. Prudent use is critical. The use must be done when a diagnosis has been made by a competent person, like a vet surgeon for that matter. And then we're also asking them to make commitments that in their production system, they will lay emphasis on ensuring hygiene is at highest level possible, biosecurity has been done properly, and that the animals are kept in a comfortable environment with the adequate space and all the animal husbandry processes that ensure that antibiotics is minimized. But it's important to also say, we are saying that part of animal welfare is the fact that a sick animal must also be treated. And if it's treated, then there are certain things we need to look at. There are withdrawal periods when you are treating an animal with antibiotics, and each antibiotic has a certain period around which the products coming from the animal should not get into the food chain. All these things are things we are looking at critically to work with industry. We are starting to say, can we have industry standards around certain things? The stocking density is a critical one, because the more animals you pack in an enclosed space, the more likelihood that they're going to have respiratory problems and start creating problems in the production system. So in developed countries like Europe has now a standard where they're saying it's actually European law that you cannot have chickens more than 30 kilograms per meter squared. But of course, because industry had gone to 42 kilos, they're saying let's give time over up to 2030 to ensure that this is done properly.
Calvin Osore, Kenchik's assistant company vet, is based at the laboratory's quality control department to ensure that the products from the company meet international quality standards.
We have guidelines that show us what we need to give to the birds for them to meet their positive animal welfare aspects. So we have policies that also guide us on what we need to do to ensure that the meat and the other products we're producing meet all the international and national food safety standards. We also ensure that our birds, as I said, have an environment that is enriched enough for them to be able to perch. So we have perches, we have pecking objects for them to be able to express their natural behaviors. We provide litter, which is at a depth that is high enough to ensure that they can sunbathe and they can peck around. So ideally, what we do is provide as natural an environment as possible for our birds in their poultry units.
In poultry farming, as natural an environment as possible for the birds has a direct correlation with the quality of the bird.
Remember, birds love pecking, they love perching, they love sunbathing, and if you do not provide an environment that allows them to actually explore those behaviors, you're going to find a bird that does not grow as required. Now, sometimes people do not see the correlation between animal welfare and food safety, but if the bird does not live and adapt to the environment as it should be, it affects food safety. That is one. In addition to that, at Kenchik, what we insist on is what we call biosecurity, which is just a set of practices that are aimed at preventing the introduction of diseases in the flock. So we try to make sure that the disease does not get into the flock and in so doing also get into the food system and affect people. So we ensure that our employees are tested regularly against foodborne infections. We ensure that there are hygiene stations around the farm, foot baths, hand washing facilities, and so on around the farm. We ensure that before you get to our chicken, you actually have to shower, change from your street clothes into new clothes before you actually get to see the birds. We also ensure that at Kenchik, we ensure that our flock is monitored by government agencies. The Directorate of Veterinary Services have regular inspection visits in our farms. The Kenya Bureau of Standards actually also has regular visits to our farms, to our hatcheries, and to our processing plant to just make sure that whatever standards we have set are aligning to what the national bodies want. And other than that, what you have here is a laboratory that can actually tell you if there's anything going on, if there's any pathogen that has been introduced into the food system, and if there's anything that you need to do to prevent the introduction of antibiotic residues in the chicken.
This antibiotic monitoring, he says, is done weekly using samples from chicken in the farms to make sure that they are free from infections and antibiotics.
We also have what we call environmental swabs. So we go around swabbing hands of our employees, making sure they're clean. We also take samples of the surfaces, the house, the drinkers, and all the other equipment, again weekly. We also get samples of processed products from our processing plant every week to check for pathogens, to check for salmonella, to check for campylobacter, E. coli, and the other bacterial pathogens every week. In addition to that, we also look out for antibiotic residues because we don't want to sell meat that is already contaminated with antibiotic residues. So every week before a batch of meat goes out to the market, we get those samples here and we sample them to ensure that none of the meat going to the market has antibiotic residues.
This use of antibiotics and their monitoring is an important aspect of farming that should involve everyone.
So there's engagement at certain levels, at the professional level, the people who make diagnostics, the vets need to be clear that it's not just about recommending use of antibiotics. In fact, we are saying the way antibiotics has been used in production systems in this country is wrong because farmers are able to access reserve drugs over the counter in agrovets. And we are saying that should be the regulation, the regulatory authorities, in this case the Veterinary Medicines Directorate, needs to emphasize that antibiotics are prescription-only drugs and they can only be accessed by a farmer once the farmer has a prescription. We need to restrict the use and availability of antibiotics because it's the same molecule. What we use in animals is the same that is used in humans.
You cannot take your shortcut around livestock farming, and that is more so in poultry farming. So you have to make sure that you're following strict biosecurity measures. You have to make sure that you're involving a veterinarian. You have to make sure that you're giving proper feed to your birds, and then you won't need to take shortcuts. So we know in any industry you'll have unscrupulous traders who want to fasten the growth of the birds, for example, by using means that are not really legal. But at Kenchik, we ensure that we do not cut corners. If you do not cut corners, you ensure that your birds are receiving water and feed that is fit for their consumption. You ensure that biosecurity practices are adhered to. You ensure that you are engaging the services of veterinarians. At Kenchik, we have a vet at hand every now. If you have an issue in the farm, there will be a vet there in the next 1 hour. And you also ensure that you are involving the government in whatever you're doing. They're giving you a seal of approval. Then you won't need to fasten the growth. And in many ways, if you cut corners, that will, along the food value chain, it will be seen. And over time, people realize that whatever you're doing, your meat is not really fit for human consumption.
Animal welfare policies are becoming a requirement for international trade. Remember that global trade is controlled by World Trade Organization, but World Trade Organization then has given World Organization for Animal Health the preserve to manage and ensure that trade is driven around certain standards. So People are beginning to look at animal welfare policies. Organizations are beginning to do rigorous audits, animal welfare audits, to ensure that the animals are humanely kept during the production. And even how we transport them is becoming key, because people are also realizing that the farmer can do a very good job and you end up with a good quality product. But then you tie the pig behind a motorbike, or you hang the chicken on the handlebar of a motorbike. What then happens? The animal goes through a lot of stress. Stress really leads to release of hormones like adrenaline, which then makes the product a poor quality product. The animal during transportation can also have injuries because of how you're transporting it. If they're two packed in a vehicle and they're rubbing against each other, they'll end up with broken limbs, broken wings, which then is condemned at the processing level because of public health considerations, where there's a broken limb or where there are wounds and bruises, a foci for bacteria to get into the product, which then would cause public health problems.
A One Health approach to monitoring antimicrobial use is critical, involving a whole of society approach in health, water and sanitation, food and agriculture.
Organizations are beginning to sample to ensure that the product that gets onto their production in their value chain is not having any antibiotic residues, and that is also driving certain things that we are looking at. So again, internationally, there are certain things that are being looked at. Tests around certain chemicals that could be used in production systems is also becoming critical. People are also taking swabs to ensure that the organism, the product is not contaminated with bacteria which could have been coming from the production system itself. And so there are trade rules and there are trade processes that are being looked at. In fact, in our situation, a country like ours has also ratified things like the East African sanitary and phytosanitary rules or mandates that then drive processes around what is acceptable. Are there products like chemicals that are acceptable, and at what level? If you find, if you're taking milk, for instance, and you find some level of bacteria, is it acceptable, and what level is acceptable? If it's chemical like antibiotic residue, are there acceptable levels? So all these things are trade rules that Kenya has committed itself into, and this then drive processes around what you're looking at in humane and sustainable production systems.
Apart from the risk of antimicrobial resistance, lifestyle diseases is an area Dr. Yamo says is of concern.
Factory farms globally have also contributed to other health impacts. They've contributed to things like obesity. Because of the way food culture then changes, you find more and more people tending to eat fast foods. Yeah, and therein lies a challenge, because even in our urbanization process, and you can see what's happening around us, we are getting more and more fast foods going into counties, going into the villages, and what essentially is we are moving away from eating traditionally nutritive, good value foods and starting to eat fast foods, which is giving us challenges. We are getting obesity, we are getting what is loosely termed as lifestyle diseases.
Other than human health impacts of factory farming, its environmental health impact and contribution to climate change is an aspect the experts are looking into.
Factory farming is also contributing to climate change, because remember that 25% of carbon emissions, the greenhouse gases, are actually coming from farming systems. And out of the 25%, 30% of that 25% is actually coming from livestock production system. Livestock is one of the best producers of methane. And so those are the things that we're looking at. If you're now looking at climate change, those are things that are becoming critical. Factory farming is also contributing to environmental degradation and loss of biodiversity, because we need to clear large tracts of land to grow soya or corn that is used to feed animals. Yeah, and by so doing, we are losing a lot of environment, biodiversity. We're also destroying environment. And if you look at a country like ours, there's also conflict between humans and animals, because these large tracts of farms, large factory farms, also need to be put or sited in certain lands. And those lands are at certain areas, what used to be wildlife corridor. So there's all these things that we are looking at, and we are saying maybe it's time for Africa to take a step back and say, before we go to where Europe is and Europe or the developed world is trying to come back to where Africa is, maybe we need to be where we are and start seeing what alternative ways of production that do we need to look at.
All our sites are NEMA compliant. We have NEMA certificates, and we also ensure that they're also compliant with each different county environmental legislation. And we have inspections done by those bodies every now and then. So we ensure we don't pollute the environment. We ensure we also are adhering to both the local, international, and national guidelines. That is one. Secondly, what we have done, we've taken our operations a step further. We not only want to adhere to national guidelines and standards, but we are aiming to be the best food processor in Africa in terms of food safety and animal welfare. So what we do is that we also have regular audits by our international partners, by international organizations. We also partner with World Animal Protection and other organizations to just help us make sure that we are meeting those international standards that we are talking about.
One of the things we are doing currently is saying, can the governments have a moratorium on factory farms, which is to slow them down so that we understand the implication. And there's actually a petition that is going out across Africa and across the world, collecting signatures, which will be used to be presented around about COP27, the climate meeting in November in Cairo. And for us, Africa, it's interesting that it's in Cairo. What impact and what message are we sending to the rest of the world? Especially considering that Africa bears the brunt of a lot of problems that have been caused by factory farms elsewhere. When you see drought, when you see climate change, we are the hardest hit continent. And so we need to look at how we then impact that discussion in November. And that's part of the reason why then as an African organization, we have decided to take the lead and say, can we place a moratorium on factory farms and drive that process for people to understand that it's not just business as usual, but we need to change certain things that we are doing.
While there is need to meet global food demands, sustainable and responsible farming ensures that these farming practices do not harm man, animal, and the environment in the long run. Dr. Masi Korir for KTN News Health Digest.